The antique porcelain teacup trembled in 17-year-old Madison Cooper's hands as she carried it across the marble floor of the penthouse. Steam rose from the delicate china, but what floated in that amber liquid would destroy more than just one man's afternoon. It would unravel a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of corporate America, expose a decades-old cover-up, and prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't money or influence. It's the truth, served at exactly the right temperature. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Madison didn't know as she approached tech mogul Richard Sterling's private study was that the tea she carried contained something that would either save her dying mother's life or send Madison to prison for the rest of hers. The choice had already been made. The consequences were about to unfold. The elevator climbed silently through the glass tower that pierced Seattle's skyline like a gleaming needle. Madison Cooper pressed herself against the polished steel wall, her reflection fractured into 1,000 worried pieces in the mirror-like surface. At 17, she carried herself with the careful precision of someone who had learned early that mistakes had consequences, that being noticed often meant being blamed. Her mother, Sarah Cooper, stood beside her, adjusting the collar of her crisp black uniform for the 100th time since they left their cramped apartment in Tacoma that morning. Sarah's hand shook slightly, not from nerves, though she had plenty of those, but from something far more sinister, something that had been eating away at her for months. "Remember what we discussed," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the elevator's mechanical hum. "You stay in the kitchen area. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't touch anything that isn't absolutely necessary." She paused, her green eyes meeting Madison's in the reflection. "And whatever you do, don't stare at Mr. Sterling. He doesn't like being watched." Madison nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. Hidden in the small canvas bag slung over her shoulder were 3 things that defined her world: a worn paperback copy of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, a water bottle, and a small glass vial containing what looked like herbal supplements. The vial had cost them their last $100, money they desperately needed for rent, but Sarah's condition was getting worse, and the treatments weren't covered by their bare-bones insurance. The elevator doors opened with a whisper, revealing the 92nd floor of Sterling Technologies headquarters. It wasn't just an office, it was a monument to excess. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of Elliott Bay, while the interior was decorated with furniture that cost more than most people's cars. Everything was white and chrome and glass, sterile as a laboratory and twice as cold. Richard Sterling stood at the center of it all, a man who had built his empire on the promise of revolutionizing clean energy. At 55, he possessed the kind of aggressive charisma that could fill a stadium or crush a competitor with equal ease. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit impeccably tailored, and his smile held the warmth of a corporate press release. He was speaking rapidly into a Bluetooth headset, pacing back and forth in front of a massive desk that seemed to hover above the city below. "Tell the senators that our testimony next week will be comprehensive," he was saying, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "The EPA investigation is a witch hunt, and we'll prove it." Standing nearby was his son, Blake Sterling, a 22-year-old carbon copy of his father, but without the earned gravitas. Blake lounged in a designer chair, scrolling through his phone with the casual arrogance of someone who had never worked for anything in his life. When he noticed Sarah and Madison, his lips curved into a smirk that made Madison's skin crawl. "Dad hired a babysitter too?" Blake called out, not bothering to lower his voice. "What's in the bag, kid? Homework?" Madison felt heat rise in her cheeks. She clutched her bag tighter, feeling the weight of the vial inside. "Books," she managed, her voice steady despite the humiliation. "How scholarly," Blake said with mock approval. "Maybe you can read while the adults handle real business." Richard ended his call and turned his attention to the two women. His gaze swept over Sarah with a clinical assessment of someone evaluating a piece of equipment. "Mrs. Cooper, you're precisely on time. I appreciate punctuality in my staff." "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," Sarah replied, her voice carefully neutral. "This is my daughter, Madison. I apologize for bringing her, but—" Richard waved a dismissive hand. "No explanation necessary. I assume she'll be invisible." His eyes fixed on Madison for a moment, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. There was something predatory in that look, something that made her understand why her mother had warned her about being watched. "Today is particularly important," Richard continued, walking to his desk and gathering a stack of documents. "We're hosting a delegation from the Environmental Protection Agency at 3 o'clock. These people have been making unfounded accusations about our manufacturing processes in Oregon. Absolute nonsense, of course, but the media loves a good environmental scandal." Blake looked up from his phone. "Why not just buy her off like the others?"
Richard's expression darkened. "Because Dr. Walsh can't be bought. She's one of those insufferable idealists who actually believes in her cause." He turned back to Sarah. "Which is why today's presentation must be flawless. The documents, the refreshments, the atmosphere, everything must demonstrate that Sterling Technologies is beyond reproach." Madison watched this exchange with growing unease. There was something in Richard's tone, something beneath the smooth corporate speak that made her think of her mother's deteriorating health, of the mysterious illness that had appeared shortly after Sarah began working the night shift at Sterling's Oregon facility 18 months ago. Sarah had been a quality control inspector at the manufacturing plant, working the graveyard shift to earn the overtime pay they desperately needed after Madison's father died in a construction accident. For 6 months, she'd tested water samples and monitored emission outputs, filing reports that always came back marked within acceptable parameters. Then the headache started, followed by the tremors, the nausea, the fatigue that no amount of sleep could cure. When Sarah finally saw a doctor, the blood tests revealed elevated levels of industrial chemicals that had no business being in the human body. Chemicals that, according to her research, were known to cause exactly the symptoms she was experiencing. But Sterling Technologies' official position was that their facilities were completely safe. Their own environmental reports, filed with state and federal agencies, showed zero contamination. When Sarah tried to file a workers' compensation claim, she was told there was no evidence linking her illness to her employment. In fact, according to Sterling's medical experts, her condition was likely genetic or lifestyle related. The company had been generous, though. When Sarah's illness forced her to quit the facility job, they'd offered her a position in the executive housekeeping staff. Lower pay, but flexible hours and health insurance. It was, Richard Sterling had personally assured her, the company taking care of its own. What they hadn't told her was that the health insurance had a lifetime cap that she'd already exceeded. What they hadn't mentioned was that her genetic condition was also affecting 6 other former employees from the same facility. What they certainly hadn't revealed was that the EPA's investigation had found evidence of systematic document falsification and deliberate contamination cover-ups. Madison knew all this because she'd spent months in the Seattle Public Library researching everything she could find about Sterling Technologies and environmental law. She'd read Rachel Carson's Silent Spring so many times the pages were falling out, learning about corporate environmental crimes and the people who expose them. She'd studied chemistry and toxicology, trying to understand what was happening to her mother's body. And she'd learned about oleander extract. The vial in her bag contained a concentrated solution derived from the Nerium oleander plant, a common ornamental shrub that happened to be one of nature's most potent sources of cardiac glycosides. In the right dosage, oleander extract was used in traditional medicine for heart conditions. In slightly higher concentrations, it caused severe gastrointestinal distress, cardiac arrhythmia, and, if the victim was lucky, temporary but dramatic symptoms that would require immediate medical attention. Madison had spent weeks calculating the exact amount needed to make Richard Sterling violently ill without killing him. Not because she wanted to hurt him, but because she needed him in a hospital. She needed his blood tested. She needed medical professionals to find the same industrial chemicals in his system that were slowly killing her mother. The plan was simple in its desperation. If Sterling's own blood showed contamination from his company's chemicals, it would prove that the environmental reports were falsified. It would validate her mother's illness. It would expose the cover-up that had destroyed so many lives. Of course, it would also make Madison a poisoner, a criminal, possibly a killer if she miscalculated the dose. But watching her mother grow weaker every day, seeing their savings disappear into medical bills for treatments that barely slowed the progression of her illness, Madison had reached a conclusion that terrified her. Sometimes doing the right thing required doing something terrible. "Madison will assist you with serving refreshments," Richard was saying to Sarah, pulling Madison back to the present. "The EPA team will expect the usual corporate hospitality, coffee, sparkling water, and I'd like you to prepare the imported tea service for Dr. Walsh specifically. She mentioned in her correspondence that she prefers Earl Grey." Sarah nodded. "Of course, Mr. Sterling. Shall I use the Spode china?" "The Royal Crown Derby. Nothing but the best for our federal guests. We want them to understand that Sterling Technologies operates at the highest level of sophistication." As they spoke, Madison's hand moved unconsciously to her bag. The vial felt warm against her palm, as if it were alive. She thought about her mother's trembling hands, about the medical bills piling up on their kitchen table, about the other families she'd found online who were going through the same nightmare. And she thought about Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the EPA investigator who was risking her career to pursue the truth. Walsh had already survived 2 attempts to discredit her professionally. Her funding had been cut 3 times. She'd received death threats that the FBI deemed non-credible, despite their specificity and intimate knowledge of her personal life. If today's meeting went as Richard Sterling planned, Dr. Walsh's investigation would be officially closed. The families of the contaminated workers would never see justice. Sterling Technologies would continue poisoning communities while presenting themselves as environmental pioneers. Unless something went very, very wrong with Mr. Sterling's afternoon tea. The morning passed slowly as Sarah prepared the executive conference room for the EPA meeting. Madison helped arrange documents, polish glassware, and set up the elaborate refreshment station that would showcase Sterling's hospitality. Every movement felt surreal, as if she was watching herself from outside her own body.
At 2:30, Sarah began preparing the tea service. The Royal Crown Derby china was brought out, delicate cups and saucers that probably cost more than Madison's monthly food budget. The imported Earl Grey was measured precisely, the water heated to exactly 185 degrees Fahrenheit. "Mr. Sterling likes his tea service presented at exactly 3 o'clock, Sarah explained as she worked. Dr. Walsh's cup should be prepared first, as the guest of honor. Then Mr. Sterling's, then the rest of the delegation. Madison watched her mother's careful preparations, noting how Sarah's hands had stopped shaking when she was focused on her work. This job was all they had left. If Madison went through with her plan and was caught, Sarah would lose her employment, her health insurance, everything. But if Madison didn't act, her mother would die. The chemicals in Sarah's system were cumulative, irreversible. The experimental treatments they couldn't afford might slow the progression, but they wouldn't cure her. Sarah Cooper was 39 years old, and she was dying because Richard Sterling valued profit over human life. At 2:55, Madison made her choice. While Sarah was distracted with arranging the serving tray, Madison slipped into the small kitchenette adjacent to the conference room. Her hands moved with steady precision as she opened the vial and measured out exactly 3 drops of the oleander extract. It was colorless, odorless, and would dissolve completely in the hot tea. She had calculated that this dose would cause severe but temporary symptoms. Richard Sterling would become violently ill within 20 minutes.
He would require emergency medical treatment. His blood would be tested, and if Madison was right about the contamination, those tests would reveal the same industrial chemicals that were killing her mother. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was about to poison a man with a natural extract to prove he'd been poisoning people with industrial chemicals. Madison returned to the conference room just as her mother was placing the final cup on the silver tray. Sarah looked up, smiled tiredly, and handed Madison the tray. "Would you mind carrying this to the conference table? My hands are a bit unsteady today." Madison took the tray, feeling the weight of the porcelain and the weight of her decision. Richard Sterling's cup sat in the center, the Earl Grey steaming gently, the oleander extract invisible in the amber liquid. In 5 minutes, the EPA delegation would arrive. Dr. Walsh would begin her questioning, Sterling would deflect and deny, and then he would reach for his tea. Madison carried the tray across the conference room, each step feeling like a mile. She was 17 years old, and she was about to either save her mother's life or destroy her own. The choice had been made. The consequences were about to unfold. At exactly 3 o'clock, the elevator doors opened to reveal 5 people who would determine the fate of Sterling Technologies, and, unknowingly, the fate of Madison Cooper. Dr. Jennifer Walsh stepped out first, a woman in her mid-40s with prematurely gray hair and the kind of tired determination that came from fighting battles most people didn't even know existed. She wore a simple navy blazer and carried a worn leather briefcase that had seen more government offices than most politicians. Richard Sterling's transformation was immediate and remarkable. The predatory businessman vanished, replaced by the concerned CEO who cared deeply about environmental responsibility. His smile broadened as he strode forward with outstretched arms. "Dr. Walsh, what an honor to finally meet you in person. I've followed your work on industrial water systems for years, truly groundbreaking research." Dr. Walsh accepted his handshake with professional courtesy, but Madison noticed her eyes never stopped moving, cataloging details, searching for inconsistencies. "Mr. Sterling, thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I know your time is valuable." "Nonsense. Environmental stewardship is Sterling Technologies' highest priority. We're eager to address any concerns and demonstrate our commitment to sustainable practices." He gestured toward the conference table, where Madison's carefully prepared tea service waited. "Please, make yourselves comfortable. We've prepared refreshments." As the delegation settled around the polished mahogany table, Madison felt time slow to a crawl. The poisoned teacup sat innocuously among the others, its contents cooling to the perfect drinking temperature. Richard Sterling took his usual seat at the head of the table, directly in front of his designated cup. Sarah moved efficiently around the room, serving coffee to most of the delegation, while Madison stood frozen by the refreshment station. Dr. Walsh declined coffee, requesting tea instead, exactly as Richard had anticipated. Madison watched her mother pour fresh Earl Grey into a clean cup, her hand steady now that she was performing the familiar routine. Blake Sterling lounged in a chair near the windows, supposedly taking notes on his laptop, but actually scrolling through social media. He looked up occasionally to smirk at something on his screen, radiating the kind of bored arrogance that made Madison want to scream. "Before we begin," Richard said, reaching for his teacup, "I want to emphasize that Sterling Technologies has always maintained the highest environmental standards. Our Oregon facility has passed every inspection, met every requirement, and exceeded most industry benchmarks." Dr. Walsh opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. "Mr. Sterling, we've received reports from former employees suggesting that your environmental monitoring data may not reflect actual conditions at the facility. Specifically, we have testimony from workers who claim they were instructed to falsify water quality reports." The cup was halfway to Richard's lips when he paused, his smile flickering slightly. "Former employees? Dr. Walsh, I'm sure you understand that disgruntled workers sometimes make unfounded accusations when they're seeking compensation for unrelated health issues." Madison's heart hammered against her ribs. Richard's pause had lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity.
The poisoned tea was cooling in his hands, the oleander extract fully dissolved and waiting. "These aren't disgruntled employees seeking compensation," Dr. Walsh replied evenly. "These are people who are dying, Mr. Sterling. 7 former workers from your facility have developed identical symptoms consistent with chronic exposure to industrial solvents. 3 have already lost their jobs due to medical disabilities. 1 is a single mother who can no longer afford her treatment." Sarah, who had been quietly arranging the remaining refreshments, went very still. Madison saw her mother's face pale as she realized Dr. Walsh was talking about people like her, people exactly like her. Richard lifted the teacup again, and Madison held her breath. "Dr. Walsh, I understand your concern for these individuals, but correlation isn't causation. Our medical experts have reviewed their cases, and the consensus is that their conditions are likely genetic or lifestyle-related. Sterling Technologies maintains comprehensive health monitoring for all our employees, and we found no evidence of workplace-related illness." The tea touched his lips. Madison watched, transfixed, as Richard Sterling took his first sip of the Earl Grey. The liquid disappeared into his mouth, and he swallowed, continuing to speak as if nothing had happened. "Furthermore," he continued, setting the cup back on its saucer, "our environmental compliance record speaks for itself. We've invested millions in state-of-the-art filtration systems, real-time monitoring equipment, and redundant safety protocols." Madison realized she'd been holding her breath and forced herself to exhale slowly. It was done. The oleander extract was now in Richard Sterling's system, beginning its work. According to her research, symptoms would manifest within 15 to 30 minutes. First nausea, then cardiac irregularities, then the violent gastrointestinal distress that would send him to the hospital. Dr. Walsh spread several documents across the table. "I'd like to review some specific data with you. These are water quality readings from your facility, taken by our independent monitoring team last month." She slid a chart toward Richard. "As you can see, we found elevated levels of trichloroethylene, benzene, and dichloromethane in groundwater samples taken within a half-mile radius of your plant." Richard picked up his teacup again, taking another sip as he studied the documents. Madison noticed his brow furrow slightly, not from concern about the data, but as if he were experiencing a mild headache. "These readings are certainly concerning," Richard said carefully, "but I should point out that this area has a long history of industrial activity. The contamination you've detected could be from any number of sources dating back decades." "Could be," Dr. Walsh agreed, "except that our chemical analysis shows a signature pattern consistent with the specific solvents used in your semiconductor cleaning processes. Furthermore, the contamination levels increase as you move closer to your facility, following the natural groundwater flow pattern." Blake looked up from his phone, finally paying attention to the conversation. "Are you seriously accusing us of poisoning the neighborhood? That's insane. We have families living in this area too." Dr. Walsh turned her calm gaze on the young man. "Mr. Sterling, environmental contamination isn't about intent. It's about systems and oversight. Companies can cause serious harm even when they believe they're following proper procedures." Richard took a third sip of tea, larger this time. Madison noticed a slight tremor in his hand as he set the cup down. The oleander was beginning to work. "Doctor," Richard said, his voice still controlled but with a subtle strain, "I appreciate your thoroughness, but I think you're drawing conclusions that aren't supported by the evidence. Our facility operates under strict EPA guidelines with regular inspections and comprehensive reporting." Dr. Walsh opened another folder. "That brings me to my next concern. We've obtained copies of your internal environmental reports from a whistleblower, and they show significantly different readings than what you submitted to regulatory agencies." The color drained from Richard's face, partly from alarm at her words, but Madison suspected the oleander was also beginning to affect his circulation. His breathing seemed slightly labored. "Doctor," Richard said, loosening his tie slightly, "I think there's been some misunderstanding. Perhaps we should schedule a follow-up meeting when you've had time to verify the authenticity of these alleged documents."
But Dr. Walsh wasn't finished. She pulled out a photograph and placed it on the table.
It showed a section of Sterling's Oregon facility, but the image had been taken with specialized equipment that revealed something invisible to the naked eye. "This thermal imaging photo was taken last week," she explained. "It shows heat signatures indicating where liquids are being discharged from your facility. As you can see, there are at least 3 outflow points that don't appear on any of your official schematics." Richard leaned forward to examine the photograph, and Madison saw him wince slightly. The first wave of nausea was beginning. He pressed his hand briefly to his stomach, then forced himself to sit back in his chair. "I'm not familiar with those particular discharge points," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. "But I can have our facilities manager provide detailed explanations for anything that appears irregular." Blake suddenly stood up, his face flushed with anger. "This is ridiculous! You people come in here with your accusations and your conspiracy theories, trying to destroy everything my father's built? Sterling Technologies has created thousands of jobs and revolutionized clean energy technology." "Blake," Richard said sharply, then immediately regretted raising his voice as it seemed to intensify his growing headache. "Sit down. Let me handle this." Dr. Walsh remained unperturbed by Blake's outburst. "Mr. Sterling, I'm not here to destroy anything. I'm here to protect public health. The contamination we've detected isn't theoretical. It's real, it's dangerous, and it's affecting people's lives." Richard lifted his teacup one final time, finishing the last of the poisoned Earl Grey. Madison watched the empty cup return to its saucer and realized there was no going back now. In the next few minutes, Richard Sterling would become violently ill, and the trajectory of everyone's life in this room would change forever. "Perhaps," Richard said, his voice now noticeably strained, "we should take a brief recess. I'd like to consult with our legal team before proceeding further." But even as he spoke, Madison could see the telltale signs that her desperate plan was working. Richard's face had taken on a grayish pallor, and he was beginning to perspire despite the air-conditioned coolness of the conference room. The oleander extract was circulating through his system, seeking out the very cardiac cells that kept him alive. Dr. Walsh gathered her documents. "Mr. Sterling, I'm not here to destroy anything. I'm here to protect public health. The contamination we've detected isn't theoretical. It's real, it's dangerous, and it's affecting people's lives." Richard lifted his teacup one final time, finishing the last of the poisoned Earl Grey. Madison watched the empty cup return to its saucer and realized there was no going back now. In the next few minutes, Richard Sterling would become violently ill, and the trajectory of everyone's life in this room would change forever. "Perhaps," Richard said, his voice now noticeably strained, "we should take a brief recess. I'd like to consult with our legal team before proceeding further." But even as he spoke, Madison could see the telltale signs that her desperate plan was working. Richard's face had taken on a grayish pallor, and he was beginning to perspire despite the air-conditioned coolness of the conference room. The oleander extract was circulating through his system, seeking out the very cardiac cells that kept him alive. Dr. Walsh gathered her documents. "Mr. Sterling, you're clearly unwell. We should call 911. "That won't be necessary," Richard insisted, but his words were interrupted by a sudden violent retching sound. His hand flew to his mouth as his body fought against the toxic assault on his system. Madison watched in fascination and horror as the man who had destroyed so many lives was brought low by 3 drops of plant extract. Part of her felt vindicated. This was justice for her mother, for all the workers Sterling had poisoned, but another part of her was terrified by the reality of what she had set in motion. In approximately 10 minutes, Richard Sterling would collapse. Emergency services would be called. His blood would be tested at the hospital, and if Madison was right about the contamination in his system, those tests would reveal the same industrial chemicals that were slowly killing her mother and the other workers. The truth would finally come out. The only question was whether Madison would be arrested for attempted murder before anyone had a chance to hear it. Richard Sterling's face had transformed from its usual commanding bronze to an alarming shade of gray-green. What had started as subtle discomfort was rapidly escalating into something that couldn't be ignored or explained away. He pressed his palm against his chest, his breathing becoming shallow and irregular. Dr. Walsh paused mid-sentence. Her trained eye immediately recognized the signs of medical distress. "Mr. Sterling, are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine," he managed, though his voice had taken on a strained quality that suggested otherwise. Beads of perspiration dotted his forehead, despite the conference room's cool temperature. He tried to stand, but the movement triggered a wave of nausea so intense that he gripped the edge of the table for support. The carefully crafted corporate facade finally cracked, revealing genuine alarm beneath. Blake jumped up from his chair, his earlier arrogance replaced with concern. "Dad, what's wrong?" Madison stood frozen by the refreshment station, watching her plan unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and growing terror. The oleander was working exactly as she had researched, cardiac glycosides binding to sodium-potassium pumps in Sterling's heart muscle, disrupting the electrical signals that kept his heart beating steadily. Sarah moved instinctively toward her employer, her maternal instincts overriding years of trained invisibility. "Should I call a doctor?" "No," Richard said quickly, then immediately contradicted himself as another wave of symptoms hit. "Actually, perhaps, Blake, call Dr. Morrison. Tell him I need to see him immediately." Dr. Walsh closed her folder and stood up. "Mr. Sterling, you're clearly unwell. We should call 911. "That won't be necessary," Richard insisted, but his words were interrupted by a sudden violent retching sound. His hand flew to his mouth as his body fought against the toxic assault on his system. Madison watched in fascination and horror as the man who had destroyed so many lives was brought low by 3 drops of plant extract. Part of her felt vindicated. This was justice for her mother, for all the workers Sterling had poisoned, but another part of her was terrified by the reality of what she had set in motion. Blake was already on his phone, speaking rapidly to someone on the other end. "Dr. Morrison, it's Blake Sterling. My father is having some kind of medical episode. Yes, we're at the office. No, I don't know what caused it." Richard's condition deteriorated rapidly. The nausea intensified, accompanied by the irregular heartbeat that Madison had calculated would be the most alarming symptom. His pulse was becoming erratic, skipping beats and racing in a pattern that would terrify any medical professional.
"I need to lie down," Richard admitted, his pride finally cracking under the assault of physical distress. Sarah immediately moved to help him, her years of caring for Madison's ailing father overriding any consideration of workplace hierarchy. Dr. Walsh approached with professional concern. "Mr. Sterling, I'm trained in first aid. Can you describe your symptoms?" Richard's answer came in gasps between waves of nausea. "Chest pressure, heart racing, feel like I'm going to be sick." Madison realized with mounting panic that she might have miscalculated the dosage. Richard Sterling was a large man, but he'd consumed the poison tea faster than she'd anticipated. The concentration of oleander in his system might be higher than she'd intended. Blake ended his call and turned to the room with obvious frustration. "Dr. Morrison is in surgery. His office said they'd send someone, but it could be 20 minutes. 20 minutes is too long," Dr. Walsh said firmly. "We need to call an ambulance now." As if summoned by her words, Richard Sterling's body convulsed with a violent retching episode that brought up everything he'd consumed in the past hour. The expensive Earl Grey tea splattered across the polished conference table along with the remnants of his lunch. Madison watched the vomit spread across the mahogany surface and felt a moment of pure terror. What if the hospital couldn't identify the oleander poisoning in time? What if they assumed it was a heart attack and gave him medications that would interact badly with the plant toxins? What if she just killed Richard Sterling instead of exposing him? Sarah moved with practiced efficiency, grabbing towels from the kitchenette to clean up the mess. Her movements were automatic, born from years of caring for sick family members, but Madison noticed her mother's hands were shaking again. "That's it," Dr. Walsh declared, pulling out her cell phone. "I'm calling 911. Blake tried to intercede. "Wait, let's just see if he feels better. Your father is experiencing cardiac distress and severe gastrointestinal symptoms. This isn't something we wait out." Richard's breathing had become labored, and his skin had taken on a clammy quality that made him look years older. He slumped in his chair, no longer able to maintain the powerful posture that had intimidated so many business rivals. 911 emergency, came the voice through Dr. Walsh's phone speaker. "This is Dr. Jennifer Walsh with the EPA. I'm at Sterling Technologies headquarters, 92nd floor. We have a 55-year-old male experiencing severe cardiac symptoms and gastric distress. We need an ambulance immediately."
As Dr. Walsh provided details to the emergency dispatcher, Madison found herself studying Richard Sterling's face. The arrogant billionaire who had threatened her mother's livelihood that morning was now vulnerable, frightened, and completely dependent on the help of others. But more importantly, in a few hours, he would be in a hospital where his blood would be tested, where medical professionals would find not just the oleander extract, but also the industrial chemicals that had been slowly accumulating in his system for years, the same chemicals that were killing Madison's mother. Blake paced frantically near the windows, alternating between concern for his father and anger at the situation. This is insane. He was fine this morning. He had his usual physical last month and everything was perfect. One of the EPA scientists, who had remained silent throughout the meeting, spoke up. "Has your father been experiencing any unusual stress lately? Sometimes cardiovascular episodes can be triggered by environmental factors." Madison almost choked on the irony. Environmental factors, indeed. Sarah finished cleaning the table and approached Richard with a clean towel. "Mr. Sterling, this might help," she said softly, offering to wipe his perspiring forehead. Richard looked up at her, and for a moment Madison saw something unexpected in his eyes, not the calculating coldness she'd grown accustomed to, but genuine human vulnerability. "Thank you, Sarah," he whispered. The use of her mother's first name struck Madison as significant. In 2 years of employment, Richard Sterling had never addressed Sarah as anything but Mrs. Cooper or simply the help. Now, facing his own mortality, the barriers of class and power seemed suddenly irrelevant. Dr. Walsh ended her call and returned to Richard's side. "Can you tell me what you've eaten or drunk in the past few hours?" Richard's answer came in broken fragments. "Coffee this morning, light lunch, the tea." He gestured weakly toward the empty teacup that sat innocuously on the table. Madison felt her blood freeze. Was he going to identify the tea as the source of his illness? Would suspicion immediately fall on the people who had prepared it? "What kind of tea?" Dr. Walsh asked. "Earl Grey," Blake answered when his father seemed unable to continue. "It's his usual afternoon tea. Sarah prepared it the same way she always does." Dr. Walsh's gaze shifted to Sarah, who had gone pale at the mention of her name in connection with Richard's symptoms. "Mrs. Cooper, did you notice anything unusual about the tea? Different taste, smell, color?" Sarah shook her head, her voice barely audible. "No, nothing. I prepared it exactly the same way I always do. The same tea, the same china, the same temperature." Madison watched her mother's face crumble as the implications became clear. If Richard Sterling died from something he'd consumed, Sarah would be the primary suspect. A disgruntled employee with access to his food and drink, whose own health had been destroyed by his company's neglect. The elevator chimed in the distance, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps and rolling equipment. The paramedics had arrived with remarkable speed, testament to the power of calling for help from the top floor of one of Seattle's most prominent buildings.
3 emergency medical technicians burst into the conference room with professional urgency. They took in the scene quickly. A middle-aged man in obvious distress, surrounded by concerned colleagues and the evidence of recent vomiting. "What's the patient's name and age?" the lead paramedic asked while his team began setting up monitoring equipment. "Richard Sterling, 55 years old," Dr. Walsh responded. He complained of chest pressure, irregular heartbeat, and severe nausea. The vomiting started about 5 minutes ago. The paramedics worked with practiced efficiency, attaching electrodes to Richard's chest and checking his vital signs. Madison watched their faces for any sign of recognition, any indication that they could identify what was happening to him. "Blood pressure is elevated, pulse is irregular," one of them reported. "Sir, can you tell me about any medications you're taking?" Richard managed to list his usual prescriptions: blood pressure medication, cholesterol management, the standard pharmaceutical cocktail of a successful executive in his 50s. None of it would explain his current symptoms. "Any history of heart problems?" the paramedic continued. "No," Richard gasped. "Clean bill of health last month." The lead paramedic looked puzzled. Richard's symptoms didn't fit the pattern of a typical heart attack, but they were serious enough to warrant immediate transportation to the hospital. "We're going to take you to Seattle General. Can someone ride with us to provide medical history?" Blake immediately volunteered, but the paramedic held up a hand. "Are you family?" "I'm his son." "That works. Anyone else who might have information about what he consumed today?" Madison felt the world slowed down as all eyes turned towards Sarah. Her mother stood there, visibly shaking, knowing that her proximity to Richard's food and drink made her both a valuable witness and a potential suspect. "Sarah prepared his tea," Blake said, and Madison could hear the subtle shift in his tone, not quite accusatory, but no longer neutral. The paramedic made a note on this clipboard. "Ma'am, we might need to speak with you later about the preparation process. For now, we need to get Mr. Sterling to the hospital." As the medical team prepared to transport Richard, Madison realized that her plan was entering its most dangerous phase. Soon, Richard Sterling would be in a hospital where his blood would be tested, where the truth about the contamination might finally be revealed. But first, Madison and her mother would have to survive the investigation into how a perfectly healthy billionaire had suddenly become violently ill after drinking tea prepared by a woman whose life he'd systematically destroyed. The next few hours would determine whether Madison had saved her mother's life or doomed them both. Seattle General Hospital's emergency department had seen its share of high-profile patients, but the arrival of Richard Sterling created an immediate stir. Within minutes of the ambulance pulling up to the trauma bay, the hospital's administration had mobilized their crisis management team, anticipating media attention and potential legal complications. Dr. Marcus Chen, the attending emergency physician, had 20 years of experience reading between the lines of emergencies. When he saw the preliminary paramedic report, sudden onset cardiac irregularities and severe gastrointestinal distress in a previously healthy executive, his trained instincts immediately suspected something beyond natural causes. "Get me a full toxicology panel," he instructed the nursing staff as Richard was transferred from the ambulance gurney to the examination table. "I want comprehensive blood work, cardiac enzymes, and start him on cardiac monitoring." Blake Sterling paced the waiting area like a caged animal, alternating between frantic phone calls to family members and heated conversations with hospital administrators about privacy and media protocols. His earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by the raw fear of someone watching a parent face mortality. Meanwhile, back at Sterling Technologies, Dr. Walsh was conducting an impromptu investigation of her own. The EPA delegation had been dismissed, but she remained in the conference room with Madison and Sarah, ostensibly to provide statements about the afternoon's events. "Mrs. Cooper," Dr. Walsh said gently, settling into a chair across from Sarah, "I want you to know that my questions aren't accusations. I'm trying to understand what happened here today." Sarah sat with her hands folded in her lap, the same position Madison had seen her take countless times when faced with authority figures. Years of being invisible had trained her to make herself as small as possible when under scrutiny. "I prepared the tea exactly the same way I always do," Sarah repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Same brand, same temperature, same cups. Nothing was different." Madison stood near the window, trying to appear like a concerned daughter while internally calculating how long it would take for the hospital to identify the oleander in Richard's blood. The cardiac glycosides were distinctive enough that any competent toxicologist would recognize them, but would they think to test for plant-based poisons? Dr. Walsh pulled out a small notebook. "Can you walk me through the preparation process step by step?" Sarah's recitation was mechanical, precise. She described measuring the tea leaves, heating the water to exactly 185 degrees, steeping for 4 minutes, serving in the designated order.
Her account was so detailed and consistent that it actually made her sound more suspicious, as if she'd rehearsed the story. "And Madison," Dr. Walsh turned her attention to the teenager, "you helped your mother with the service." Madison felt her throat constrict. This was the moment where one wrong word could unravel everything. "I carried the tray to the table," she said carefully. "Mom was having trouble with her hands today." It wasn't a lie. Sarah's condition did cause tremors, but Madison knew she was walking a razor's edge between truth and deception. Dr. Walsh made another note. "Has your mother been experiencing health problems?"
The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Madison realized that Dr. Walsh wasn't just investigating Richard's illness, she was building a profile of potential motives. A sick employee whose condition might be linked to Sterling's company would have every reason to want revenge. "My mother has been ill," Madison said slowly, "but she would never hurt anyone. That's not who she is." Dr. Walsh's expression softened slightly. "Madison, I'm not suggesting your mother intentionally harmed Mr. Sterling, but I need to understand all the factors that might be relevant." At Seattle General, Dr. Chen was reviewing Richard's initial blood work with growing puzzlement. The cardiac enzyme showed stress, but not the pattern of a heart attack. The complete blood count was normal, except for some irregularities that didn't fit any standard diagnostic category. But it was the preliminary toxicology screen that made him frown and order additional tests. There were trace compounds in Richard's blood that the standard panel couldn't identify. Organic molecules with a chemical signature that suggested plant alkaloids. "Nurse Patterson," he called to his lead nurse, "get me the hospital's toxicology specialist. I think we're dealing with a poisoning." The word poisoning transformed the medical emergency into a potential criminal investigation. Hospital security was notified, and within minutes, a Seattle police detective was en route to question the family about potential exposure sources. Blake's phone rang constantly as news of his father's hospitalization began to leak. Sterling Technologies' stock price was already fluctuating on rumors of Richard's condition, and the company's board of directors was demanding answers that Blake couldn't provide. Dr. Chen approached Blake in the waiting room, his expression grave. "Mr. Sterling, I need to ask you some difficult questions about your father's condition." Blake looked up from his phone, his face haggard with stress. "Is he going to be okay?" "We're doing everything we can," Dr. Chen said diplomatically, "but I need to understand what he might have been exposed to. His symptoms suggest he may have ingested something toxic." The word toxic hit Blake like a physical blow. "Toxic? You mean someone poisoned him?" "I'm saying his blood work shows compounds that aren't normally present in the human body. We need to identify the source to determine the appropriate treatment." Blake's mind immediately went to the most obvious suspects. "The tea! He drank tea right before he got sick. Sarah Cooper prepared it. She's one of our cleaning staff." Dr. Chen made a note. "We'll need to speak with Miss Cooper about the preparation process. Do you know where she is now?" "Still at the office, I think. The EPA people were asking her questions." Back at Sterling Technologies, Dr. Walsh was indeed asking questions, but not the ones Madison had expected. Instead of focusing on the mechanics of tea preparation, she was probing deeper into the family's background and relationship with Sterling's company. "Sarah, you mentioned that you used to work at Sterling's Oregon facility. Can you tell me about that experience?" Sarah's composure finally cracked. The months of suppressed fear and anger came pouring out in a torrent of words that she had never been allowed to speak. "I was a quality control inspector for 6 months. I tested water samples every night, documented everything according to protocol, but the results kept coming back marked as equipment errors whenever they showed contamination." Dr. Walsh leaned forward, her attention completely focused. "You found contamination?" "Constantly. Levels that were way above what the reports claimed. I asked my supervisor about it, and he told me the equipment was old and giving false readings. He said corporate was upgrading everything and not to worry about the discrepancies."
Madison watched her mother finally tell the truth she'd been carrying for months. Sarah described the mysterious illness that had forced her to leave the facility, the medical bills that had consumed their savings, the company's offer of a housekeeping position that felt more like hush money than genuine assistance. "Dr. Walsh," Sarah said, her eyes filling with tears, "I've been dying for 18 months. My doctors say I have industrial chemical poisoning, but Sterling's medical experts claim it's genetic. I can't afford the treatments that might help me, and I can't prove that the company caused my illness." Dr. Walsh set down her pen and looked directly at Sarah. "Mrs. Cooper, what you're describing is exactly what our investigation has been trying to prove. You're not the first worker to come forward with these symptoms." The revelation that Sarah wasn't alone in her suffering hit Madison like a thunderbolt. Her mother wasn't just a victim, she was a witness to a systematic cover-up that had affected multiple families. Dr. Walsh continued, "The problem is that Sterling Technologies has been very effective at discrediting individual claims and preventing workers from connecting their illnesses to the facility. That's why today's meeting was so important." Madison realized with growing dread that her poisoning of Richard Sterling might have derailed the very investigation that could have saved her mother legally. By taking justice into her own hands, she might have destroyed the EPA's case and painted her family as criminals rather than victims. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "This is Detective Rodriguez with Seattle PD. I need to speak with Sarah Cooper immediately regarding an incident at Sterling Technologies. Please call me." Madison stared at the message, understanding that the investigation had officially begun. The police were coming for her mother, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Dr. Walsh noticed Madison's pale expression. "Is everything all right?" Madison held up her phone with shaking hands. "The police want to talk to my mom." The conference room fell silent as the weight of the situation settled over them. Richard Sterling was fighting for his life in a hospital, and the woman who had prepared his last meal was about to become the prime suspect in an attempted murder case. But hidden in Richard's blood were the same industrial chemicals that were slowly killing Sarah Cooper, evidence that could vindicate her claims or be dismissed as coincidental contamination. The next few hours would determine whether the truth about Sterling Technologies would finally be exposed or whether Madison's desperate act would bury it forever under criminal charges. Sarah looked at her daughter with a mixture of love and terror. "Madison, whatever happens, I want you to know that I'm proud of who you've become. You're stronger than I ever was." Madison wanted to tell her mother the truth, that she was the one who had poisoned Richard Sterling, that Sarah was innocent of everything except being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But confessing now would only make things worse. Instead, she took her mother's trembling hand and squeezed it gently. "We're going to get through this, Mom. The truth has a way of coming out." Neither of them realized how prophetic those words would prove to be. Detective Maria Rodriguez had seen enough corporate crime scenes to recognize when a case was more complicated than it appeared. At 42, she was Seattle PD's lead investigator for white-collar crimes involving potential bodily harm, and the Sterling Technologies incident had all the hallmarks of a case that would consume the next several months of her life. She arrived at Sterling's penthouse office building 30 minutes after receiving the call from Seattle General's emergency department. The elevator ride to the 92nd floor gave her time to review the preliminary information. Prominent tech executive hospitalized with suspected poisoning, last known consumption was tea prepared by domestic staff, potential workplace revenge motive. The conference room still held traces of the afternoon's drama. Dr. Walsh remained with Sarah and Madison Cooper, but the atmosphere had shifted from investigative inquiry to protective custody. Sarah sat rigidly in her chair while Madison positioned herself between her mother and the door like a guardian. Detective Rodriguez entered with professional composure, her badge visible but not aggressively displayed. She was a small woman with steel-gray hair and observant brown eyes that missed nothing. Her approach was deliberately non-threatening, She knew that frightened witnesses provided better information than defensive ones. "Mrs. Cooper, I'm Detective Rodriguez. I understand you had a difficult afternoon." Sarah looked up with the wary expression of someone who had learned not to trust authority figures. "Is Mr. Sterling going to be okay?" "The doctors are taking good care of him. I need to ask you some questions about today's events, but first I want you to understand that you're not under arrest. You are free to leave at any time, and you have the right to have an attorney present." Madison stepped forward. "Do we need a lawyer?" Rodriguez studied the teenager with interest. Most 17-year-olds didn't immediately think about legal representation unless they had something to hide or had previous experience with the system. "That's entirely up to you," Rodriguez said carefully. "Right now, I'm just trying to understand what happened. Mrs. Cooper, can you tell me about your relationship with Mr. Sterling?" Sarah's account was methodical and precise. She described her transition from facility worker to executive housekeeper, her medical condition, and the financial pressures that made her current job essential for survival. As she spoke, Rodriguez took notes and observed body language. Dr. Walsh interjected occasionally to provide context about the EPA investigation and Sarah's potential value as a witness. "Detective, Mrs. Cooper's testimony could be crucial to our environmental contamination case. She has first-hand knowledge of document falsification at Sterling's Oregon facility." Rodriguez nodded but kept her focus on the immediate situation. "Mrs. Cooper, walk me through the tea preparation process. Start from when you first entered the kitchen area." As Sarah recounted her afternoon's events, Madison felt sweat beading on her forehead despite the air conditioning. Her mother's account was accurate and detailed, but it would inevitably lead to questions about who had access to the tea between preparation and consumption. "The tea was ready at 2:55. I placed it on the serving tray and Madison carried it to the conference table." Rodriguez's pen paused. "Madison carried the tray?" "Yes," Sarah said, unaware of the significance. "My hands were shaking today, so I asked her to help me." The detective turned her attention to Madison. "How long did you have the tray before placing it on the table?" Madison's mind raced. This was the critical moment, the point where her story would either hold up under scrutiny or crumble completely. "Maybe 30 seconds, she said, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "I walked straight from the kitchenette to the conference room." "Did you notice anything unusual about the tea? Any strange smell, color, or temperature?" "No, nothing," Madison replied, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "It looked like regular Earl Grey tea." Rodriguez made another note. "Was anyone else in the conference room when you placed the tray?" "Mr. Sterling was on a phone call. Blake was at his laptop. The EPA people hadn't arrived yet." Dr. Walsh confirmed the timeline. "We arrived at exactly 3 o'clock. The tea service was already set up." Rodriguez closed her notebook and looked around the conference room. The crime scene, if it was a crime scene, had been thoroughly contaminated by the afternoon's events. The table had been cleaned, the cups removed, and multiple people had moved through the space. "I'll need to collect the tea service for testing," she announced. "Do you know where the cups and serving pieces are now?" Sarah pointed toward the kitchenette. "I washed everything after the paramedics left. It's all in the drying rack."
Rodriguez suppressed a sigh. If there had been any trace evidence on the serving pieces, it was likely gone now. Sarah's automatic response to clean up after a crisis had inadvertently destroyed potential forensic evidence. Madison felt a momentary surge of relief, followed immediately by guilt. Her mother's compulsive cleanliness might have saved them both from detection, but it also meant they would never be able to prove Richard Sterling's contamination came from his own company's chemicals. Rodriguez's phone buzzed with a message from the hospital. She read it quickly, her expression revealing nothing. "Mrs. Cooper, I'm going to need you to come to the station to give a formal statement. Madison, you'll need to come as well." "Are we under arrest?" Madison asked again. "No, but Mr. Sterling's condition has stabilized, and the doctors have identified some unusual compounds in his blood. We need to determine the source."
Sarah stood up slowly, her frailty more apparent than usual. "Detective, I know how this looks. A sick employee with access to her boss's food and drink, but I didn't hurt Mr. Sterling. Whatever happened to him, it wasn't intentional." Rodriguez helped Sarah gather her belongings. "Mrs. Cooper, I've been doing this job for 15 years. In my experience, people who are guilty don't usually volunteer information that makes them look suspicious. Your cooperation today speaks well for you." As they prepared to leave for the police station, Dr. Walsh pulled Rodriguez aside. "Detective, there's something you should know about the broader context here. The EPA has been investigating Sterling Technologies for environmental contamination that may have caused illness in multiple workers. Mrs. Cooper's medical condition appears to be directly related to chemical exposure at Sterling's facility." Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting a motive for revenge?" "I'm suggesting that if Sterling's blood work shows the same industrial chemicals that are making Mrs. Cooper sick, it would prove our contamination case and vindicate her claims." The detective considered this information carefully. Environmental contamination cases were complex, often involving corporate cover-ups and systematic document falsification. If Sterling Technologies had been poisoning workers and then denying responsibility, it would create a compelling motive for retaliation. But it would also mean that any evidence of contamination in Sterling's blood could be dismissed as planted by a vengeful employee. At Seattle General Hospital, Dr. Chen was reviewing the latest test results with growing amazement. The toxicology report showed not only the plant alkaloids that had caused Sterling's acute symptoms, but also a cocktail of industrial chemicals that had been building up in his system for years. "This is unprecedented," he told the toxicology specialist who had been called in to consult on the case. The patient shows chronic exposure to trichloroethylene, benzene, and dichloromethane, the same chemicals used in semiconductor manufacturing. The specialist studied the lab reports. "The acute symptoms are definitely from cardiac glycosides, probably oleander or a related plant, but the chronic contamination is fascinating. How would a tech executive be exposed to these levels of industrial solvents?" Dr. Chen had been wondering the same thing. The pattern suggested either occupational exposure or intentional poisoning with industrial waste, both scenarios that would have serious legal implications. Blake Sterling sat in the hospital waiting room, fielding increasingly frantic calls from Sterling Technologies' board of directors. The company's stock had dropped 12% since news of Richard's hospitalization broke, and shareholders were demanding answers. "No, I don't know when he'll be able to return to work. The doctors are still running tests. Yes, I understand the Nakamura deal is at risk. No, I can't authorize the stock buyback without Dad's approval." Between calls, Blake found himself thinking about Sarah Cooper. He'd never paid much attention to the cleaning staff, but now he remembered seeing her around the Oregon facility during his summer internship 2 years ago. She was one of the quality control inspectors, always working late shifts and taking detailed notes. A disturbing thought began to form in Blake's mind. What if Sarah's current illness was related to her work at the facility? What if she knew something about the operations there that her father had wanted to keep quiet? Blake pulled out his phone and called Sterling Technologies' head of security. "Dave, I need you to pull all the employment records for Sarah Cooper. She worked at the Oregon facility before transferring to executive services." "Yes, I'll hold." While Blake investigated Sarah's background, Detective Rodriguez was driving Sarah and Madison to the police station. The car was quiet except for the sound of radio traffic from dispatch. Madison stared out the window at the Seattle skyline, thinking about how different the city looked from the passenger seat of a police car. Sarah broke the silence. "Detective, can I ask what will happen if the tests show that Mr. Sterling was poisoned?" Rodriguez glanced in the rearview mirror. "That depends on what the tests reveal and whether we can determine the source. If someone intentionally poisoned him, they'll be charged with attempted murder." Madison felt her stomach clench. Attempted murder carried a sentence of 10 to 20 years in Washington state. Even if her plan succeeded in exposing Sterling's environmental crimes, she would spend the rest of her youth in prison. But if the poisoning was accidental, or if there are mitigating circumstances, the charges could be reduced. A lot depends on intent and context. Sarah reached over and took Madison's hand. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. Madison squeezed her mother's fingers, thinking about the vial that was now empty and hidden at the bottom of a dumpster 6 blocks from Sterling's building. She had committed a serious crime to save her mother's life, but the unintended consequences were threatening to destroy them both.
The police station loomed ahead, a concrete fortress where Madison would have to choose between protecting herself and protecting the investigation that could expose Sterling Technologies' environmental crimes. The truth was about to become more complicated than anyone had anticipated. 3 weeks after Richard Sterling's hospitalization, the Seattle courtroom was packed with reporters, environmental activists, and Sterling Technologies employees. What had begun as a suspected poisoning case had evolved into something far more complex, a federal investigation that would reshape how corporate environmental crimes were prosecuted. Madison Cooper sat in the witness gallery next to her mother, both of them wearing clothes donated by a legal aid organization. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of depositions, medical examinations, and media attention that neither of them had been prepared for. Judge Patricia Hawkins called the court to order as federal prosecutor Amanda Richardson prepared to present evidence that would either vindicate Sterling Technologies or expose one of the largest environmental cover-ups in Pacific Northwest history. Your Honor, Richardson began, the evidence will show that Richard Sterling's hospitalization, while initially appearing to be an isolated poisoning incident, actually revealed a systematic pattern of environmental contamination that has affected dozens of workers and their families. Sterling's defense attorney Marcus Webb rose immediately. Objection, Your Honor. My client is the victim here, not the perpetrator. The prosecution is attempting to put the victim on trial while ignoring the real crime, attempted murder by a disgruntled employee. Judge Hawkins nodded. I'll allow the prosecutor to present her evidence, but let's keep the focus on establishing facts rather than making accusations. Dr. Chen was the first witness called. He testified about Sterling's medical condition, describing the unusual combination of acute plant poisoning and chronic industrial chemical exposure found in his blood work. Dr. Chen, Prosecutor Richardson asked, in your medical opinion, how long had Mr. Sterling been exposed to these industrial chemicals? Based on the concentration levels and the specific compounds involved, I would estimate continuous exposure over a period of approximately 2 years. The chemicals had been accumulating in his fatty tissues and organs, suggesting regular contact with contaminated sources. Webb cross-examined aggressively. Doctor, isn't it possible that these chemicals were introduced into my client's system by the same person who poisoned him with plant toxins? Dr. Chen shook his head. The exposure patterns are completely different. The plant alkaloids show acute single-dose administration. The industrial chemicals show chronic, low-level accumulation over months or years. They couldn't have been introduced simultaneously. The next witness was Dr. Walsh from the EPA. She presented evidence of systematic document falsification at Sterling's Oregon facility, including internal memos that directly contradicted the environmental reports filed with federal agencies. Dr. Walsh, can you explain the significance of finding these same industrial chemicals in Mr. Sterling's blood? It proves that the contamination at Sterling's facility wasn't contained to the manufacturing areas. If Mr. Sterling, who worked primarily in executive offices, shows these exposure levels, it indicates that the contamination was far more extensive than the company reported. Richardson called Sarah to the stand. Sarah's testimony was devastating in its simplicity. She described the discrepancies between actual test results and official reports, the pressure to classify contamination as equipment errors, and the mysterious illness that had begun affecting workers 6 months before she left the facility. Mrs. Cooper, Richardson asked, did you ever discuss your concerns with Mr. Sterling directly? Once. I asked to speak with him about the test results I was seeing.
His assistant told me that Mr. Sterling didn't have time to discuss technical details with facility workers. Webb's cross-examination focused on Sarah's motive for revenge. Mrs. Cooper, you blame Sterling Technologies for your illness, don't you? I don't blame them. I know they caused it. The question is whether they did it intentionally or through negligence. Webb pressed harder. And that anger, that knowledge that you were dying because of decisions made by Richard Sterling, that gave you a powerful motive to hurt him, didn't it? Sarah looked directly at the defense attorney. Mr. Webb, if I wanted to hurt Richard Sterling, I wouldn't have used something that would be detected in his blood work within hours. I would have done something that couldn't be traced back to anyone. The courtroom fell silent. Sarah's response was so unexpected, so logically sound, that even Webb seemed momentarily speechless. Richardson called Madison to the stand. Madison had spent weeks preparing for this moment, working with prosecutors and victim advocates to craft testimony that would serve the broader case while protecting her from criminal liability. Madison, Richardson began gently, you were present during the EPA meeting when your mother served tea to Mr. Sterling. Did you observe anything unusual about the preparation process? Madison had decided weeks earlier that her only path forward was a modified version of the truth. Mr. Sterling became ill very quickly after drinking the tea. But what struck me most was how defensive he became when Dr. Walsh started asking about the facility workers who were sick. Can you elaborate on that? He kept insisting that their illnesses were genetic or lifestyle related, but Dr. Walsh had evidence showing they were all exposed to the same chemicals. It seemed like he was more concerned about protecting the company than understanding why people were getting sick. Webb's cross-examination was brief. Madison's age and apparent innocence made her a sympathetic witness, and attacking her too aggressively would backfire with the jury. The turning point came when Richardson called Blake Sterling as a hostile witness. Blake had been granted immunity in exchange for his testimony about his father's knowledge of the contamination.
Mr. Sterling, Richardson began, were you aware that your father had regular contact with contaminated materials at the Oregon facility? Blake shifted uncomfortably. He visited the facility monthly for inspections. Sometimes he would tour the manufacturing areas. And during these tours, was he provided with protective equipment? Not always. Dad believed that if the facility was safe enough for workers, it was safe enough for executives. Richardson presented photographs of Richard Sterling touring the facility without protective gear, walking through areas where industrial solvents were used and stored. The images, taken from company promotional materials, showed Sterling handling equipment and materials that his own environmental reports claimed were safely contained. Mr. Sterling, Richardson continued, did your father ever express concern about his own exposure to chemicals at the facility? Blake hesitated, then answered reluctantly. About 6 months ago, he started experiencing headaches after facility visits. His doctor recommended he limit his time in the manufacturing areas. But he continued visiting the facility? Yes, he said he couldn't properly manage operations without seeing them firsthand. The irony was devastating. Richard Sterling had been slowly poisoning himself with the same chemicals that were killing his workers, but his arrogance and need for control had prevented him from acknowledging the danger. Richardson's final witness was Dr. Patricia Williams, a toxicologist who had analyzed Sterling's blood work alongside samples from other affected workers. Her testimony tied everything together. Dr. Williams, Richardson asked, what did your comparative analysis reveal? Mr. Sterling's blood showed the same industrial chemical signature as 7 other former facility workers, all of whom developed similar symptoms. The contamination pattern is consistent with exposure from a common source. In your professional opinion, what was that source? The Sterling Technologies Oregon facility. The chemical fingerprint is unique to the specific combination of solvents used in their manufacturing process. Webb made one final attempt to redirect blame. Dr. Williams,
Couldn't these chemicals have been deliberately introduced into my client's system by someone seeking to frame him? Dr. Williams shook her head. The exposure levels required to produce this contamination pattern would have taken months to achieve safely. Attempting to introduce these chemicals acutely would have killed Misty Sterling immediately. Richardson stood for her closing argument. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case began with what appeared to be a simple poisoning, but the investigation revealed something far more sinister, a systematic cover-up of environmental contamination that endangered workers and their families. She gestured towards Sarah and Madison. The Cooper family represents dozens of families who trusted Sterling Technologies with their health and safety. Instead of protection, they received lies. Instead of honest environmental monitoring, they got falsified reports. Instead of medical care when they became ill, they got legal challenges and financial pressure. Richardson paused, letting her words sink in. Richard Sterling was indeed poisoned, not by Sarah Cooper's tea, but by his own company's chemicals over a period of years. The acute plant poisoning that hospitalized him was merely the catalyst that revealed the chronic poisoning he had been inflicting on himself and others. Webb's final argument focused on the unanswered questions. Someone deliberately poisoned Richard Sterling with plant toxins. The prosecution wants to distract you with environmental issues, but the central question remains, who put oleander extract in my client's tea? Judge Hawkins instructed the jury on the complex legal standards they would need to apply. The case involved both criminal charges related to the acute poisoning and civil violations related to environmental contamination. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The foreman stood and addressed the court. On the charge of attempted murder against Sarah Cooper, we find the defendant not guilty. Madison felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. Her mother was free. On the charges of environmental fraud and endangering public welfare against Sterling Technologies, we find the defendant corporation guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in cheers from environmental activists and Sterling workers who had gathered to hear the verdict. Judge Hawkins called for order as she prepared to announce sentencing. Sterling Technologies was fined $450 million and ordered to establish a victims' compensation fund. Richard Sterling, who had recovered from his acute poisoning but faced ongoing health issues from chemical exposure, was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison for environmental fraud. Outside the courthouse, Madison and Sarah were surrounded by reporters and supporters. Dr. Walsh approached them with a broad smile. "Sarah, I wanted you to know that the EPA is establishing new protocols for environmental whistleblower protection based on your case. Your courage in speaking out has changed how we investigate corporate contamination." Sarah looked at her daughter with tears in her eyes. "Madison, your grandfather would be so proud. You always said the truth had a way of coming out." Madison hugged her mother tightly, thinking about the secret she would carry for the rest of her life. She had indeed poisoned Richard Sterling with oleander extract, but that act of desperation had inadvertently exposed a much larger crime. The medical tests triggered by her poisoning had revealed the industrial contamination that vindicated her mother and dozens of other workers. Justice had been served, though not in the way she had planned. 6 months later, Madison received a full scholarship to study environmental law at the University of Washington. The scholarship was funded by the Sterling Technologies Victims' Compensation Fund, a final irony that Richard Sterling's own money would educate the young woman who had exposed his crimes. Sarah's health improved significantly once she began receiving proper medical treatment paid for by the settlement. The industrial chemicals would never completely leave her system, but the progression of her illness was halted. Madison often thought about the chain of events that had brought them to that point.
A desperate teenager with a chemistry book and a vial of plant extract had brought down a corporate empire and exposed an environmental cover-up that might have continued for years. The truth had indeed found a way to come out, though it had taken a path that none of them could have anticipated. Sometimes justice required a catalyst, even if that catalyst came from the most unexpected source. As Madison walked across the University of Washington campus on her first day of classes, she carried with her the knowledge that the most powerful weapon against injustice wasn't always the law or the media or public pressure. Sometimes it was simply a 17-year-old girl who refused to watch her mother die in silence. The poisoned tea had changed everything. But in the end, it was the truth in Richard Sterling's contaminated blood that had set them all free.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.